Whispers in the winter of 1777. As Washington's army froze at Valley Forge, another silent battle began, one fought with secrets instead of muskets. The snow had turned to knives that winter. Each gust of wind at Valley Forge cut through the soldiers' threadbare coats like bayonets. Fires sputtered in the icy wind, and the smell of smoke mixed with hunger, sweat, and despair. Men huddled together under makeshift tents, their breath hanging like ghosts in the air. Horses died in their stalls. Bread was a memory. Hope, too, was beginning to die. But amid that desolation, General George Washington refused to surrender. While his army fought frostbite and famine, he fought something colder: ignorance. His greatest weapon that winter wasn't gunpowder. It was information. The British had taken Philadelphia, and their red-coated soldiers slept in warm homes, while Washington's men starved in the Pennsylvania wilderness. The British commander, General William Howe, believed the American rebellion was one harsh winter away from collapse. Yet Washington knew that if he could outthink his enemy, not just outfight him, the cause of liberty might still survive. That's when the whispers began. In a small tavern outside occupied New York, a man in a rough wool cloak nursed a tankard of ale and kept his eyes low. His name was Nathaniel Brewster, a name few would remember, though his deeds would ripple through history. He had once been a schoolteacher, a quiet man of letters and reason, but war had stripped him of students, of peace, and, eventually, of neutrality. Across the room, a British officer laughed loudly, boasting about troop movements and supply lines. Brewster listened, not to the words, but to the patterns. Every careless phrase was a clue. He didn't write anything down. He never did. He would walk home later, past the sentries and snowdrifts, and commit everything to memory. For Washington's army to survive, it needed food, weapons, and secrets. The British lines were tightening, and every day the Patriot cause bled more. But intelligence could change that. Brewster was one of the first to see it. He wasn't alone. A network of quiet patriots had begun to take shape. A merchant in Setauket, a courier who disguised dispatches as laundry lists, even a woman who baked coded messages into bread loaves. They didn't yet call it the Culper Ring, but the seed was there. Ordinary Americans fighting their own secret war. Meanwhile, at Valley Forge, Washington met by candlelight with one of his most trusted aides, Major Benjamin Talmadge, a young man of both courage and intellect. "General," Talmadge said softly, spreading a crude map over the table. "If we can learn what the British plan come spring, we can strike first. But our men inside New York are risking everything. We must find a way to reach them safely." Washington's eyes, hollowed by exhaustion, flickered with something fierce: hope. "Then we must create a way. A code, a system, something the enemy cannot break." That night, by firelight, the first sketches of Washington's spy network were born. Words would become numbers. Messages would be hidden in letters, invisible until brushed with heat or vinegar. Every town, every path would have a meaning known only to a few, and every whisper would pass from one loyal heart to another until it reached the general's hand. Back in New York, Brewster received his first coded message, written in invisible ink between the lines of a harmless business letter. He held it to the flame and watched the words appear like spirits. "The enemy plans a move toward the Delaware. Watch for changes in supply routes." He burned the paper and set out at once, moving through British checkpoints with a merchant's calm smile. The snow muffled his footsteps. He spoke little, listened much. Each passing soldier, each wagon, each shipment told a story to those who knew how to listen. For weeks, he sent small fragments of intelligence back to the American lines, through fishermen, farmers, and one silent rider who crossed the icy Hudson by moonlight. Piece by piece, Washington began to see the larger picture. The British weren't preparing for an attack on Valley Forge. They were tightening their grip on New York, expecting the Americans to crumble from hunger and despair. That miscalculation, born of arrogance, would become Washington's advantage. Still, every whisper carried danger. One night, Brewster was cornered by British dragoons after curfew. He carried no papers, no proof of treason, only a small Bible. "What's your business here?" the officer demanded, his voice sharp in the frost. Brewster met his eyes calmly. "Teaching scripture, sir. Even in war, men need God." The officer sneered, then laughed. "Then pray for warm weather." He tossed the Bible back. Brewster's heart hammered, but his face betrayed nothing. Inside that Bible, hidden in the spine, was a thin sliver of parchment, his next report to the Patriots. He survived that night and many others through the power of silence. By March of 1778, the tide had begun to turn. Washington's men, trained by Baron von Steuben, grew into a disciplined force. Supplies arrived from France, and the intelligence Washington had gathered through his spies allowed him to predict British maneuvers before they happened. At one meeting, Washington unrolled a British campaign map captured from a courier and smiled faintly. "They think we're blind. Let's show them we can see in the dark." And so, when spring thawed the snow, Washington's army moved not in chaos, but with purpose. His troops intercepted British foraging parties, cut off supplies, and struck where the enemy was weakest. The Americans no longer stumbled through fog. They walked through it, guided by whispers. Historians would later record the battles, Monmouth, Yorktown, the treaties and triumphs, but few would write about the men who never fired a shot, whose names never appeared in newspapers. Men like Nathaniel Brewster, who vanished one winter's night after delivering a final coded message that warned Washington of a British trap near the Delaware. His body was never found. Some say he drowned crossing the river. Others believed he simply disappeared, shedding his old life like a shadow once his duty was done. Washington never learned his fate, but he often spoke of the silent ones who served unseen.
The man behind the mask. In a world of shifting loyalties, one man's true identity was hidden even from his closest allies. They called him Samuel Culper, but that wasn't his name. Even General Washington never learned who he truly was. Only a handful of men knew his face, and fewer still survived long enough to speak of it. In the shadows of the Revolutionary War, where a misplaced word could cost a life, he was both ghost and guardian, the invisible hand that fed Washington the lifeblood of victory, information. New York, 1778. The city was a British fortress. Redcoats patrolled every street, loyalists filled the taverns, and the Stars and Stripes were a forbidden dream. Yet amid this web of occupation, a single American spy moved unseen, walking the line between loyalty and death. His real name was Abraham Woodhull, a farmer from Setauket, Long Island, but in the secret code books of the Patriot cause, he was Culper Sr., later joined by a mysterious partner known as Culper Jr. Together, they built the most effective spy network the New World had ever seen. And though their names would be hidden for centuries, their whispers shaped the fate of a nation. The story began with doubt. Woodhull had never sought heroism. He was cautious, even fearful, a man who prized his land, his family, and his quiet life above all else. His cousin, Major Benjamin Tallmadge, had already joined Washington's army and was working in intelligence. It was Tallmadge who first saw what his cousin could become. "Abraham," he had said one stormy night in 1778, "we need someone inside New York, someone ordinary, someone the British won't suspect." Woodhull hesitated. "You're asking me to live a lie." Talmadge's eyes were steady. "No, I'm asking you to help win a country." That night, with the wind howling through the trees of Setauket, Abraham Woodhull put away his fear and became someone else. He became Samuel Culper. In the heart of New York City, the British held lavish dinners, while American prisoners rotted in the sugar houses along Crown Street. Redcoats laughed, danced, and boasted of their strength. But hidden among them was a quiet man with keen eyes who listened more than he spoke. Woodhull's disguise was simple: a merchant visiting the city to settle business affairs and check on family. In truth, he watched troop movements, noted the arrival of new ships, and memorized the routes of British messengers. Each night, he returned to his rented room near Wall Street and wrote carefully in cipher, using codes designed by Talmadge himself. The letters were carried by a courier, Anna Strong, a bold patriot who lived back in Setauket. She hung a black petticoat on her clothesline to signal when Brewster, the whaleboat captain, could safely cross the Sound to retrieve the messages. Each white handkerchief placed beside it told him where to land. It was a system of simplicity and brilliance, and for a time, it worked perfectly. Yet, espionage is never clean. Woodhull's life became a labyrinth of lies. To his British acquaintances, he was a loyal subject of King George. To his neighbors, he was a nervous farmer trying to avoid suspicion. To Washington, he was a nameless code number. And somewhere in between, he began to lose sight of who he really was. The constant deceit wore on him, the fear that each knock on his door might be the British coming to hang him, the guilt of lying to friends, of pretending sympathy for the crown while secretly working to destroy it. One evening, while sipping ale at a tavern filled with redcoats, Woodhull overheard a conversation between two officers. "The rebels in Pennsylvania are starving," one laughed. "If the winter doesn't kill them, we'll finish the job come spring." Another smirked. "Pity about their general, so noble, so doomed." Woodhull smiled faintly and raised his mug, but inside his chest burned a fierce resolve. He would carry that information back, no matter the cost. Returning to Setauket was perilous. British patrols prowled the countryside, and any man found crossing without papers faced the gallows. But the network worked in perfect silence. Anna's signal waited on the line. Brewster's boat appeared through the mist like a ghost, and by dawn, the coded message was already on its way to Washington's desk. When Washington read it days later, he nodded slowly. The British intended to shift forces south in the spring, toward Philadelphia. "Good work from our friend," he murmured. "Tell Culper to keep his eyes open." The general didn't know the spy's name, nor did he want to. He once wrote in a letter, "I wish to conceal his identity even from myself." Washington understood the cost of exposure. One slip could destroy them all. But not everyone was fooled by Woodhull's mask. Within the British ranks, a shrewd officer named Major John Andre, the same man who would later conspire with Benedict Arnold, began noticing inconsistencies in the flow of information. Reports were leaking, shipments intercepted. He said, "There's a ghost among us, someone close, someone clever." Andre launched quiet investigations. Interrogations followed. One by one, suspects vanished. Woodhull could feel the tightening noose. His letters grew shorter, his handwriting shakier. He wrote, "It is dangerous now. They are searching every soul. If I am discovered, my family will hang with me." Talmadge urged him to flee, but Woodhull refused. He replied, "The mask stays on until the work is done." In the summer of 1780, Woodhull intercepted rumors of a British plan that would have shattered the Revolution: the betrayal of West Point. A respected American general was planning to hand the fortress to the British. Woodhull passed the whispers through the network, but even he couldn't imagine the name attached to the treachery: Benedict Arnold. When Major Andre was later captured carrying Arnold's plans, Washington finally saw how deep the British rot went and how vital his invisible agents were. Without the Culper ring, without Woodhull's vigilance,
America's revolution might have ended in that single act of betrayal. As the war dragged on, Woodhull's role faded into deeper secrecy. He survived suspicion, arrest, even torture of friends. And when peace finally came in 1783, he returned to his farm in Setauket, a weary man with ghosts in his eyes. No one in the village knew the truth. To them, he was simply Abraham, the farmer, quiet, unremarkable, forgettable. He never spoke of his deeds. His codebooks were burned, his letters hidden in attic walls. It wasn't until nearly a century later that historians uncovered fragments of his correspondence, lines of invisible ink that had once steered the fate of a revolution. In the end, the man behind the mask remained just that, a shadow among heroes. But Washington never forgot him. In a private note to Talmadge, he wrote, "There are heroes who win their glory in battle, and those whose valor must never be known. The latter build the foundations of victory."
The birth of the Culper Ring. How an unlikely network of farmers, merchants, and couriers formed the most elusive spy ring of the Revolution. The dawn was pale and cold when the first letter changed the course of a war. It was nothing remarkable to look at, an ordinary folded page sealed with wax carried by a fisherman across the gray waters of Long Island Sound. But hidden between its lines, written in invisible ink, were words that could tip the balance of the Revolution. General George Washington, seated by a flickering fire in his headquarters at Middlebrook, read the decoded message slowly. It spoke of British troop numbers, naval supplies, and an officer in New York leaking information to London. When he finished, Washington leaned back and said quietly, "We have a new weapon." That weapon wasn't a musket or cannon. It was the Culper Ring. And its soldiers were not generals or trained agents. They were farmers, tavern keepers, and ordinary Americans who risked everything to build the most effective spy network the world had ever seen. The idea began with Major Benjamin Talmadge, Washington's young spy master and former cavalry officer. He had seen too many good men die because they lacked intelligence about enemy plans. The British had an entire system of informants, paid agents, double dealers, and loyalist sympathizers, feeding them every American secret. Washington needed something better, something invisible. In 1778, Talmadge met secretly with his old friend Abraham Woodhull, the cautious Long Island farmer who had already begun passing small bits of information from British-occupied New York. The two men sat in a dark room lit by a single lantern, the air thick with tobacco and fear. "You can't do this alone," Talmadge said. "You need a network. Men and women who can pass messages, move unnoticed, vanish when needed." Woodhull nodded. "But who would risk it? One mistake and the rope waits for us all." Talmadge leaned closer. "Then we choose those with nothing to prove. Ordinary people whose silence no one suspects." That night, the Culper Ring was conceived, not in a palace or a war council, but in a whisper between two friends. The first to join was Caleb Brewster, a rough-mannered seaman with arms like oak branches and a heart loyal to Washington's cause. He knew the waters between Long Island and Connecticut better than any man alive. His whaleboat would become the artery of the ring, slipping through British patrols under moonless skies to ferry letters, reports, and the occasional spy across the Sound. "The sea," Brewster once said, "is a colder friend than any man, but she keeps a secret." Then came Anna Strong, a farmer's wife whose courage matched any soldier's. Her home in Setauket became a hub of coded signals. She hung a black petticoat on her clothesline to show that Brewster's boat was ready, and white handkerchiefs to mark which cove was safe to land. No British officer ever suspected that a woman's laundry was guiding one of the most dangerous espionage operations of the war. Finally, there was Robert Townsend, a quiet Quaker merchant who lived inside New York City. Talmadge recruited him after seeing his deep knowledge of trade and his access to British officers. He wrote under the alias Culper Jr., and his reports became the backbone of Washington's intelligence network. To everyone else, he was a mild-mannered shopkeeper who sold cloth and ink. In truth, every transaction, every shipment note, every rumor whispered over a pint in the coffee house became part of his invisible war. The ring's genius lay not just in courage, but in craft. Talmadge designed a cipher book, a code that replaced common words with numbers. Washington was 711, New York became 727, and the word attack was 341. Every message was a puzzle that only the initiated could solve. They used invisible ink made from a mixture of iron sulfate and water, which appeared only when heated or brushed with a special reagent. Letters passed openly through British checkpoints containing harmless talk about grain or prices, but between the lines, the real war was being fought. Washington himself marveled at their ingenuity. He once wrote, "A single man in the field may be captured, but a ring of silent friends may outlast an empire." Their first major success came in early 1779. Townsend learned of a British plan to counterfeit American currency and flood the colonies with fake dollars to collapse their fragile economy. He smuggled word to Woodhull, who sent it through Anna Strong's signal to Brewster. Within days, Washington had the warning. The plan was stopped before it began. Then came news of a far deadlier plot, a British assault on the French fleet at Newport. Again, the ring passed the message in time for Washington to prepare. When the attack failed, Washington wrote personally to Talmadge, "The intelligence from your friends was of infinite importance." Each success deepened the trust between the unseen agents and the commander who depended on them. But with success came danger. By late 1779, the British had grown suspicious. They knew someone was leaking information from inside New York, and they began tightening their patrols. Major John Andre, the brilliant British spymaster, was determined to expose the network. His agents prowled taverns, intercepted letters, and questioned merchants. Messages in invisible ink, letters soaked in secrets, how coded words and lemon juice carried the fate of a nation. The spy didn't need a weapon. He only needed a quill, a candle, and a few drops of lemon juice. By day, he was a quiet merchant, blending into the noise of British-occupied New York. He sold fabric, ink, and paper, items the officers bought without a second thought. But by night, under the faint glow of tallow candle, Robert Townsend, known only by his alias, Culper Jr., turned those same materials into weapons of war. His battleground was the page, his bullets were words, and his mission was to deliver truth so secretly that even the messenger wouldn't know what he carried. This was not the age of satellites or telegraphs. Every secret had to move by hand, across rivers, through enemy patrols, past noose and musket. The smallest letter could bring victory or destruction. And so the Americans learned to hide their hopes in invisible ink. It began in the winter of 1779. The British had tightened their grip on New York City, turning it into a fortress of spies and soldiers. Washington's army, battered but unbroken, camped far to the north, desperate for intelligence. Culper Jr. had access to information few others could touch.
British officers often gathered in the coffee house he managed, bragging after too much rum about troop movements, naval supply routes, and whispers of betrayal. Townsend listened silently, his polite smile concealing the calculations running in his mind. Each night, he would return to his small room above the shop, take out his quill, and begin writing. The letter looked innocent, a note about market prices or the latest shipment of tea. But between those harmless lines, in the narrow spaces of white paper, he would write again, this time with lemon juice mixed with iron salts. The ink would dry invisible, the words fading into nothingness. Only when heated over a flame would the message reappear, as if summoned by fire itself. Those invisible letters carried secrets that would change the war. The process was delicate, almost sacred. After Townsend finished, he'd hand the letter to Abraham Woodhull in Setauket, who signed under his alias Culper Sr. From there, Anna Strong would hang a black petticoat on her clothesline, signaling to Caleb Brewster that a message was ready to cross the Sound. Brewster, his oar cutting through icy water under a moonless sky, would deliver it to Talmadge's contact in Connecticut. By the time it reached Washington's camp, the letter had passed through 6 pairs of hands, each knowing only enough to survive interrogation. Once in Washington's possession, the commander would hold it near the firelight. Slowly, faint letters would rise from the blank page like ghosts. Troop numbers, ship arrivals, codes, and warnings. This was more than clever chemistry. It was survival. For every letter that reached Washington, dozens were intercepted. If even one British officer discovered how to reveal those invisible words, the entire network would die. In one evening in March 1780, Townsend sat alone in his dimly lit room, working on what would become one of the most important messages of the war. He had overheard officers speaking of a plan to attack the newly arrived French fleet in Newport, Rhode Island. If true, the attack could destroy America's only major ally. He worked feverishly, writing in the cipher Washington's spymaster, Major Talmadge, had created, hundreds of coded numbers replacing words. Quote, 711, Washington, should beware. Enemy preparing to strike French ships near 727, New York. Movement swift, urgent, end quote. Between the lines of a fake letter about shipments of molasses, he painted the real report in invisible ink. As he finished, he heard boots on the stair. His heart froze. British patrol. He blew out the candle, shoved the letter into a stack of business papers, and opened the door just as the soldiers entered. Inspection, one said curtly. Routine check. Townsend's pulse pounded in his ears as they rummaged through his desk. One soldier picked up the letter, and squinted at it. What's this? Trade correspondence, Townsend said calmly. Would you like to read it? It's dreadfully dull. The soldier smirked, tossed it back, and they left. Only after the sound of boots faded did Townsend sink into his chair, trembling. He exhaled and smiled faintly. Dull, he whispered. Yes, dull enough to save a nation. That letter reached Washington within the week, and because of it, the French fleet was warned and survived the British strike. Washington later wrote in secret correspondence, quote, "The invisible letters have done what cannon could not." But the magic of invisible ink was without cost. The spies lived in constant fear, not just of discovery, but of time.
The chemicals sometimes failed, the paper smudged, the heat too weak to reveal the message. A single mistake could mean silence. Washington himself improved the process. He corresponded with scientists and chemists, searching for better formulas. Eventually, he acquired a special sympathetic stain, invisible until treated with a second chemical rather than heat. Only those who possessed both could read the message. This advancement saved lives. Even if letters were intercepted, they appeared harmless. One captured British courier even carried one of these invisible messages to London, never realizing he had delivered Washington's intelligence straight into enemy hands without knowing it. In the spring of 1781, the invisible ink carried perhaps its most crucial secret. Townsend learned through his network that the British were preparing to shift their forces south to Virginia under General Cornwallis. It was this knowledge that allowed Washington to move his army swiftly, setting the stage for Yorktown, the battle that would end the war. Without that invisible message, hidden beneath the ink of a mundane business report, the revolution might have dragged on for years. When peace finally came, the tools of war were laid down. Muskets were stored, uniforms folded away, but Townsend kept one object hidden, a small vial of cloudy liquid stoppered with wax. On quiet nights, he would lift it from its hiding place, watching the faint shimmer of the sympathetic stain under the candlelight. He never told anyone what it was. To his family, he was simply Robert Townsend, a merchant who lived a quiet, uneventful life. He died in 1838, never publicly revealing his role as Culper Jr. For decades, his identity was a mystery. Historians stumbled upon his letters only in the 20th century, ordinary sheets of paper that, when tested under heat, still revealed faint brown words written in invisible ink more than a century old. Those letters, once hidden in fear, glowed again, their secrets whispering through time.
Messages in invisible ink. Letters soaked in secrets. How coded words and lemon juice carried the fate of a nation. The spy didn't need a weapon. He only needed a quill, a candle, and a few drops of lemon juice. By day, he was a quiet merchant blending into the noise of British-occupied New York. He sold fabric, ink, and paper, items the officers bought without a second thought. But by night, under the faint glow of a tallow candle, Robert Townsend, known only by his alias Culper Jr., turned those same materials into weapons of war. His battleground was the page, his bullets were words, and his mission was to deliver truth so secretly that even the messenger wouldn't know what he carried. This was not the age of satellites or telegraphs. Every secret had to move by hand, across rivers, through enemy patrols, past noose and musket. The smallest letter could bring victory or destruction. And so the Americans learned to hide their hopes in invisible ink. It began in the winter of 1779. The British had tightened their grip on New York City, turning it into a fortress of spies and soldiers. Washington's army, battered but unbroken, camped far to the north, desperate for intelligence. Culper Jr. had access to information few others could touch. British officers often gathered in the coffee house he managed, bragging after too much rum about troop movements, naval supply routes, and whispers of betrayal. Townsend listened silently, his polite smile concealing the calculations running in his mind. Each night, he would return to his small room above the shop, take out his quill, and begin writing. The letter looked innocent, a note about market prices or the latest shipment of tea.
But between those harmless lines, in the narrow spaces of white paper, he would write again, this time with lemon juice mixed with iron salts. The ink would dry invisible, the words fading into nothingness. Only when heated over a flame would the message reappear, as if summoned by fire itself. Those invisible letters carried secrets that would change the war. The process was delicate, almost sacred. After Townsend finished, he'd hand the letter to Abraham Woodhull in Setauket, who signed under his alias Culper Sr. From there, Anna Strong would hang a black petticoat on her clothesline, signaling to Caleb Brewster that a message was ready to cross the Sound. Brewster, his oar cutting through icy water under a moonless sky, would deliver it to Talmadge's contact in Connecticut. By the time it reached Washington's camp, the letter had passed through 6 pairs of hands, each knowing enough to survive interrogation. Once in Washington's possession, the commander would hold it near the firelight. Slowly, faint letters would rise from the blank page like ghosts: troop numbers, ship arrivals, codes, and warnings. This was more than clever chemistry, it was survival. For every letter that reached Washington, dozens were intercepted. If even one British officer discovered how to reveal those invisible words, the entire network would die. One evening, in March 1780, Townsend sat alone in his dimly lit room, working on what would become one of the most important messages of the war. He had overheard officers speaking of a plan to attack the newly arrived French fleet in Newport, Rhode Island. If true, the attack could destroy America's only major ally. He worked feverishly, writing in the cipher Washington's spy master, Major Talmadge, had created. Hundreds of coded numbers replacing words. 711, Washington, should beware. Enemy preparing to strike French ships near 727, New York. Movements swift, urgent. Between the lines of a fake letter about shipments of molasses, he painted the real report in invisible ink. As he finished, he heard boots on the stair. His heart froze. British patrol. He blew out the candle, shoved the letter into a stack of business papers, and opened the door just as the soldiers entered. Inspection, one said curtly. Routine check. Townsend's pulse pounded in his ears as they rummaged through his desk. One soldier picked up the letter, and squinted at it. What's this? Trade correspondence, Townsend said calmly. Would you like to read it? It's dreadfully dull. The soldier smirked, tossed it back, and they left. Only after the sound of boots faded did Townsend sink into his chair, trembling. He exhaled and smiled faintly. Dull. Yes, dull enough to save a nation. That letter reached Washington within the week, and because of it, the French fleet was warned and survived the British strike. Washington later wrote in secret correspondence, "The invisible letters have done what cannon could not." But the magic of invisible ink was without cost. The spies lived in constant fear, not just of discovery, but of time. The chemicals sometimes failed, the paper smudged, the heat too weak to reveal the message. A single mistake could mean silence. Washington himself improved the process. He corresponded with scientists and chemists, searching for better formulas. Eventually, he acquired a special sympathetic stain, invisible until treated with a second chemical rather than heat. Only those who possessed both could read the message. This advancement saved lives. Even if letters were intercepted, they appeared harmless. One captured British courier even carried one of these invisible messages to London, never realizing he had delivered Washington's intelligence straight into enemy hands without knowing it. In the spring of 1781, the invisible ink carried perhaps its most crucial secret. Townsend learned through his network that the British were preparing to shift their forces south to Virginia under General Cornwallis.
It was this knowledge that allowed Washington to move his army swiftly, setting the stage for Yorktown, the battle that would end the war. Without that invisible message, hidden beneath the ink of a mundane business report, the revolution might have dragged on for years. When peace finally came, the tools of war were laid down. Muskets were stored, uniforms folded away, but Townsend kept one object hidden, a small vial of cloudy liquid, stoppered with wax. On quiet nights, he would lift it from its hiding place, watching the faint shimmer of the sympathetic stain under the candlelight. He never told anyone what it was. To his family, he was simply Robert Townsend, a merchant who lived a quiet, uneventful life. He died in 1838, never publicly revealing his role as Culper Jr. For decades, his identity was a mystery. Historians stumbled upon his letters only in the 20th century, ordinary sheets of paper that, when tested under heat, still revealed faint brown words written in invisible ink more than a century old. Those letters, once hidden in fear, glowed again, their secrets whispering through time.
Washington's quiet obsession with intelligence gathering and the mysterious figure who became his unseen weapon. The campfires at Valley Forge burned low, sending thin columns of smoke into the frigid night. Soldiers wrapped in rags muttered prayers for morning. Washington had come to understand something that few generals of his time did, that wars were not won by guns alone. They were won by information. The whispers of the enemy, the coded messages passed in plain sight. The invisible war fought behind the front lines. And for that war, he needed a weapon unlike any other. He needed someone who could disappear into the enemy's heart. It had begun months earlier, after a string of bitter defeats. The British occupied New York, their spies seemed everywhere, and Washington's own informants kept vanishing. One had been hanged on a tree outside Long Island, a warning to all who served the Patriot cause. Washington's aides urged him to focus on fortifications, on supplies, on morale. But the general's eyes stayed on the map before him, his fingers tracing the Hudson River like a lifeline. He murmured, "If I cannot know what the enemy intends, I cannot save my army." He needed someone who could move freely between worlds, a man clever enough to deceive, calm enough to endure, invisible enough to survive. That man would soon come to him not in uniform, but in the plain clothes of a merchant, Robert Townsend. Townsend had once lived among the British in New York, selling dry goods and writing for loyalist papers. He was quiet, polite, and forgettable, the kind of man you might share a drink with and never remember again. But beneath that unremarkable surface burned conviction. He had seen British officers mock starving Americans, had watched neighbors imprisoned for words spoken in anger. He believed in liberty, but he also believed that idealism without intelligence was suicide. When Abraham Woodhull, Culper Sr., approached him about joining Washington's secret network, Townsend didn't hesitate. He would become Culper Jr., the man who would feed Washington the very heartbeat of the British occupation. Washington never met Townsend face to face after his recruitment. That was by design. He understood the first rule of espionage: the fewer who know, the fewer who can betray. Instead, his contact was through coded letters carried across bays, written in invisible ink, filled with ciphers that only he and his spy master, Benjamin Talmadge, could read. Each report Townsend sent was a victory in silence. But for Washington, it became something more than intelligence. It became obsession. He would rise at dawn to scan each new dispatch. He memorized ciphers by candlelight, pored over invisible writing like a scholar studying holy scripture. He once told Talmadge, "There is no task too humble, no detail too small if it wins us a single hour's advantage." To his generals, Washington appeared reserved, almost distant. But in private, he was consumed by the invisible war, an obsession born of loss. Years before, he had sent a young spy named Nathan Hale into British lines. Hale had been caught, hanged, and left dangling as a warning to all who served the Patriot cause.
The image haunted Washington. He would never again send a man to die in vain. That winter, a courier arrived at headquarters carrying a packet wrapped in oilcloth. Inside were several letters, all written in Townsend's steady hand. One report mentioned British plans to counterfeit continental currency to destroy the rebel economy from within. Another described ships preparing to sail from New York, suggesting an assault on French allies in Newport. Each line was measured, precise. Townsend's restraint impressed Washington deeply. He remarked, "A mind of discipline, a soldier in spirit, though not in uniform." He folded the letter carefully and locked it in his desk. No one else would see it. To the outside world, Washington remained the stoic commander. To those close to him, a rumor began to spread, quietly, fearfully, that the general trusted phantoms more than men.
The secret beneath Setauket. From a sleepy Long Island village, dispatches slipped past redcoats and crossed the waters to save an army. At first glance, Setauket looked like any other quiet village on Long Island, a cluster of weathered cottages, grazing cattle, and fishermen hauling nets from the cold waters of the Sound. But beneath its calm surface, beneath the smell of salt and wood smoke, secrets moved like tides. Every knock on a door, every flicker of a lantern, every piece of laundry on a line might mean life or death. Because in 1779, this humble village, so small it barely appeared on British maps, was the beating heart of George Washington's spy network. And its people, ordinary farmers and merchants, were risking everything to keep the revolution alive. The heart of that secret world was Abraham Woodhull, a farmer whose hands were calloused from work and whose nerves were worn thin from fear. By day, he tended his fields and greeted British soldiers politely as they patrolled the road. By night, he became Culper Sr., one of Washington's most vital agents. He lived in constant tension, caught between two identities, the loyal colonial and the invisible spy. His neighbors believed he was cautious, even timid, but Washington knew the truth. Without Woodhull's reports from Setauket, the Continental Army would have been blind. And tonight, as moonlight spilled over the Sound, Woodhull's heart pounded against his ribs. He had a dispatch to deliver, a message written in invisible ink, hidden inside a merchant's invoice. If he failed, Washington's army might walk straight into a British ambush. The British garrison in Setauket had grown restless. The soldiers quartered in the Presbyterian church watched every move, their muskets stacked by the door, bayonets glinting in the candlelight. Major Benjamin Talmadge, Washington's spy master, had warned that a single slip could unravel the entire Culper ring. So Woodhull moved carefully, every gesture rehearsed, every excuse prepared. He had arranged for the letter to pass through a silent chain, people bound not by oath, but by trust. The first link was Anna Strong, his neighbor and one of the few who knew his secret. To anyone else, she was just a widow raising her children and tending her home. But to the Culper ring, she was a signal tower. When she hung a black petticoat on her clothesline, it meant a courier was waiting. The number of handkerchiefs beside it told which cove he'd used to land. That night, as the moon rose over the harbor, Anna walked to her line with calm, deliberate steps. She pinned the black petticoat first, then 3 white handkerchiefs. To anyone passing by, it was nothing unusual, just laundry drying in the night air. But to Caleb Brewster, rowing silently across the bay, it was a beacon of hope. Brewster was a seaman, broad-shouldered and fearless, his small boat painted dull gray to blend with the fog. The British Navy hunted him relentlessly, but he knew every current, every sandbar, every trick of the tide. He rowed without sound, guided only by the whisper of waves against the hull. On the shore, Woodhull waited with the dispatch hidden in his coat. The night was so still he could hear his own breathing. A dog barked somewhere in the village. Lantern light flickered briefly from the church. British sentries changing shifts. Then came the low, rhythmic splash of oars. Brewster's boat appeared out of the mist, a shadow upon the water. He motioned once, and Woodhull hurried down the slope, boots sinking into the cold sand. "Quickly," Brewster whispered. "Patrols are near the point." Woodhull handed him the folded paper, what looked like a shipment receipt for fish barrels. Brewster tucked it into a sealed pouch beneath the seat. "Tell Talmadge the message concerns movement near the Hudson. The British are shifting supplies north. Washington must act soon." Brewster nodded, then pushed off, the oars slicing through the silver surface of the Sound. Within seconds, he was gone, swallowed by fog and silence. For Woodhull, the journey back was agony. Every step felt watched, every sound amplified. When he reached his home, he saw 2 British soldiers talking by his gate. One turned as he approached. "Evening, Mr. Woodhull," the soldier said, smirking. "Out late, are we?" Woodhull forced a nervous laugh. "Checking on the livestock. Foxes have been bold lately." The soldier's gaze lingered. "Aye, foxes and traders both tend to come out at night." Woodhull's mouth went dry. But after a moment, the soldier shrugged and turned away. Inside his house, Woodhull collapsed into a chair, shaking. He poured a small glass of brandy and stared into the flame of the candle. "One mistake," he whispered, "and it's all over." Across the water, Caleb Brewster reached the Connecticut shore just before dawn. Waiting for him was Benjamin Talmadge, the officer who coordinated the entire spy ring under Washington's direct orders.
The trap for Benedict Arnold. One coded message uncovered a betrayal that could have ended the revolution in a single stroke. It began with a single sheet of paper, folded twice, smudged by the hand that wrote it, and marked with symbols only a handful of men in the world could read. To any British officer, it would have seemed meaningless, a farmer's scribble, perhaps. But to General George Washington, it was the most chilling evidence of treason yet discovered in the War for Independence. In the late summer of 1780, the American cause stood on a knife's edge. The war had dragged on for 5 grueling years. The army was unpaid, supplies were scarce, and faith in victory was fading. Washington needed hope, but what he received instead was the whisper of betrayal from within his own ranks. The coded letter had been intercepted by members of the Culper Ring, the secret intelligence network that operated in and around British-occupied New York. Abraham Woodhull, known by his alias Samuel Culper Sr., had risked everything to get that message into the hands of Washington's intelligence chief, Benjamin Talmadge, and when Talmadge read it by candlelight in his tent, the words made his blood run cold. The letter hinted at an unnamed American general who was negotiating with British command to surrender the fort at West Point, a stronghold that guarded the Hudson River and effectively controlled the lifeline between New England and the rest of the colonies. If West Point fell, the revolution would die with it. Talmadge had no proof of the traitor's identity, not yet, but he knew where to start. A man above suspicion. General Benedict Arnold had once been a hero. His victory at Saratoga in 1777 had turned the tide of the war and earned him Washington's trust. Few men had bled more for the cause. Yet behind the glory, Arnold's heart had soured. Years of being overlooked by Congress, passed over for promotion, and accused of corruption had embittered him. When he married Peggy Shippen, the beautiful young daughter of a loyalist Philadelphia family, the seed of betrayal was planted. Peggy's circle included many who sympathized with the British, including a dashing officer named Major John Andre, the head of British intelligence. In secret correspondence carried by coded letters, Arnold began negotiating with Andre.
For a sum of £20,000 and a position in the British Army, Arnold promised to deliver West Point, and with it, Washington, if fate allowed. But fate, as it turned out, had other plans. The meeting in the shadows. In September 1780, Arnold arranged a clandestine meeting with Andre near the Hudson River. Under cover of night, the two men conferred aboard the British sloop Vulture. There, they finalized the plan. Arnold would weaken West Point's defenses, delay reinforcements, and hand over critical maps to guide a British assault. Andre carried these documents hidden inside his boot when he set out to return to New York. But the Vulture came under American fire, forcing Andre to travel by land through enemy territory. Fate intervened again when three militiamen, John Paulding, David Williams, and Isaac Van Wart, stopped him near Tarrytown. Andre, thinking quickly, tried to pass himself off as a civilian. But when the men searched him and found the secret papers concealed in his boot, his fate was sealed. They brought him to the nearest American post. Within days, the evidence was on General Washington's desk. The shock at West Point. When Washington arrived at West Point expecting to meet Arnold, the general was gone. He had fled the fort mere hours before, after learning of Andre's capture. His wife Peggy feigned madness to avoid arrest, screaming hysterically as Washington's officers searched the house. Washington stood in stunned silence as he read the captured letters. His trusted general's handwriting, the maps of West Point defenses, the signatures. It was all undeniable. Arnold, his friend and comrade, had sold out the revolution. "I thought that traitor was brave, but he is brave only in villainy," Washington murmured. Arnold escaped across the Hudson to the British lines, where he was welcomed as a hero by his new masters. But the price of his betrayal haunted him forever. No British officer fully trusted him, and no American ever forgave him. Run for the river. When discovery loomed, the spies' escape turned into a race against time across British-controlled territory. The night air over Long Island was thick with fog, and the only sound was the rhythmic splash of oars slicing through black water. A single lantern, shielded by cloth, flickered inside the small wooden boat as it drifted toward the northern shore. Inside sat a man who carried no weapon, no uniform, only a letter sealed in wax and a fear that chilled him deeper than the autumn wind. His name was Abraham Woodhull, though in Washington's invisible army of spies, he was known only as Samuel Culper Sr. It was October 1779, and the Culper Ring, Washington's secret network, was operating under growing suspicion. The British had grown ruthless in rooting out informants within New York and Long Island. A single careless move could doom them all. That night, Woodhull was returning from New York City with a report hidden in the lining of his coat. The letter contained details of British troop movements, naval plans, and whispers of an impending assault on Connecticut. The information needed to reach General Washington fast. But even before his boat touched the Setauket shore, Woodhull sensed something was wrong. The patrol. He heard the hoofbeats first, slow, measured, and coming closer along the dirt road that led from the shore to his family farm. British dragoons were patrolling again. They had been questioning anyone traveling at night, searching wagons, arresting suspected rebels. Woodhull crouched behind a thicket, his breath visible in the cold. The boatman, his friend Caleb Brewster, whispered urgently, "They're closing in. If they find you with that letter, it's over." Woodhull's hand went instinctively to his coat, feeling the folded parchment against his chest. The message couldn't fall into British hands. He had two choices: hide and risk capture, or run for the river. "I'll draw them off," he hissed. "Get to the cove. I'll meet you at dawn." But Woodhull shook his head. "No. If they take me, they'll come for all of you. The ring dies with me." And then he ran. The chase.
The moon broke through the clouds, casting silver light over the open fields. Woodhull sprinted across them, his boots sinking into the wet earth, his heart pounding louder than the distant hoofbeats. Behind him, the British patrol shouted, "Stop! In the name of the king!" And the crack of a musket shot split the air. The ball hissed past his ear and buried itself in a tree. He stumbled into the woods, ducking branches and tearing through brush. Every few steps he glanced back, the red glow of lanterns bobbing through the dark behind him. There was one hope left, Anna Strong's farm. She was part of the ring, a quiet widow who signaled Brewster's arrival with black petticoats and white handkerchiefs hung on her clothesline. Her house sat near the bluff that overlooked the harbor. If he could reach it, he could slip down to the hidden cove and escape by water. But the British knew these woods too. The hiding place. He reached Anna's barn just as dawn's first light bled into the eastern sky. The smell of hay and horses filled the air. Anna appeared in the doorway, pale and frightened. "They've been here," she whispered. "They're searching every house between the mill and the church. You can't stay." Woodhull handed her the folded letter. "If I don't make it, burn this. No one can read it." Anna looked at him for a moment, then nodded. "Go. The back path leads to the bluff. Brewster's signal is out." Woodhull crept through the tall grass, hearing the distant barking of dogs, search parties fanning out. His lungs burned, his legs trembled, but he pushed forward. The woods thinned, and the glimmer of the river appeared between the trees. Freedom was just ahead.
The letter that never arrived. A courier vanished, a message lost. How a single failure nearly cost Washington everything. The night was so quiet, it felt unnatural. No crickets, no wind, no distant calls of fishermen returning home. Just the faint ripple of water against the docks of Long Island and the hurried footsteps of a man clutching a sealed envelope that could determine the fate of the Revolution. His name was Caleb Brewster, a fearless courier for Washington's Culper Ring. The letter he carried was small, written in invisible ink, containing critical intelligence about British troop movements near West Point. If it reached headquarters, Washington could prepare his defenses. If it didn't, disaster would follow. Brewster had made this crossing dozens of times before, navigating through fog, dodging patrols, and slipping past British ships like a ghost. But tonight, something felt wrong. A mistake in the shadows. Earlier that evening, Brewster had collected the letter from Anna Strong, who had signaled its readiness with her black petticoat and 3 handkerchiefs, her coded warning that the cove was safe. He set off immediately in his small rowboat, oars putting through the black water, keeping his lantern hidden beneath a canvas hood. Halfway across the Sound, a sudden squall whipped the river into churning waves. Brewster struggled to keep the boat on course, each wave threatening to capsize him. He glanced at the envelope. Its contents were more valuable than any cargo he had ever carried, and yet it was drenched in saltwater spray. By the time he reached the Connecticut shore, exhaustion had taken its toll. He pulled the boat up onto a hidden sandbar, intending to hide it and rest before moving inland. But the river had shifted some of the currents. He misjudged the tide. By dawn, the envelope had vanished, slipped from his hands, swept into the dark waters. The consequences. When Caleb finally returned to Talmadge's safe house, he had no letter to deliver. Panic set in immediately. "Did you drop it?" Talmadge asked, his eyes narrowing. I tried to secure it, sir. The tide, the storm, it's gone." Talmadge's jaw tightened. If Washington never receives this, the army could walk straight into the enemy's trap. We're not just gambling with ships or supplies, we're gambling with men's lives. Brewster felt a cold weight settle in his chest. He had faced muskets, bayonets, and British patrols,
but nothing had ever terrified him like the thought of failing Washington. The race to recover. Woodhull, Townsend, and the rest of the ring sprang into action. They retraced Brewster's path, asking fishermen and looking for signs along the riverbanks, but the letter was nowhere to be found. Every hour that passed increased the danger. British forces were mobilizing in the very area described in the lost dispatch. Washington, relying on second-hand intelligence, was moving cautiously, but he didn't know just how close the army had come to disaster. Woodhull, usually calm and meticulous, felt the strain. Every failure leaves a scar, and this one could be fatal. They had to act fast. A fortuitous discovery. 3 days later, a fisherman spotted a soaked bundle tangled in reeds along the Connecticut shoreline. He retrieved it carefully, keeping it hidden from the patrols. The envelope was waterlogged, ink running, edges frayed, but miraculously, much of the invisible ink remained legible under heat and chemical treatment. The fisherman delivered it to Talmadge, who immediately rushed to decode it. Heart hammering, he read aloud the details of British troop movements, the timing of supply shipments, and the names of officers involved. The Army could now adjust its plans. West Point would be reinforced, the supply lines rerouted. The trap that had loomed over Washington's forces was neutralized. Brewster arrived at the safe house to witness the letter's recovery. Relief washed over him in a wave so intense it made him tremble. It's safe," he whispered. Talmadge placed a hand on his shoulder. "You risked everything to carry it, Caleb. The storm and river nearly won, but it's not the loss that defines us. It's how we respond. This letter may have been delayed, but the network survived because of our vigilance." Brewster nodded, understanding for the first time that espionage was not just about bravery. It was about endurance, persistence, and the ability to adapt when everything went wrong.
The ghost of Culper Jr. Decades later, historians still search for the nameless hero who vanished into history's shadows. In the quiet corners of New York City's libraries, a faint whisper still lingers, an echo of a man who existed only in shadows. They call him Culper Jr., a name inked in secret correspondence, but the face behind it remains lost to time. Robert Townsend, the merchant-turned-spy, had walked among loyalists and British officers in plain sight. By day, he sold dry goods from his modest shop. By night, he carried letters soaked in invisible ink, each one carrying Washington's lifeblood, intelligence that could win battles and save lives. To the world, Townsend was unremarkable. Polite, quiet, and cautious, he could vanish into a crowd without notice. But to George Washington, he was indispensable, a ghost moving unseen through occupied New York. Townsend's life was a careful balance of fear and duty. Every encounter with a British officer could have ended in arrest, torture, or execution. Every letter he wrote had to be perfectly coded, every courier trusted implicitly. One misstep, one careless word, and the fragile network of the Culper ring might unravel. Yet Townsend never sought fame. He did not write memoirs. He did not boast to friends or family. After the Revolution, he quietly returned to his shop, tending accounts and receiving customers as if nothing extraordinary had ever occurred. Even his closest friends did not know the depths of his service. Washington himself never publicly acknowledged Townsend's work. Security demanded secrecy, even in victory. Townsend had become a hero in plain sight, known to no one but those who could read between the lines of invisible ink. Decades later, historians piecing together the Revolution search for his true identity. Some speculate he was a banker. Others say he was a young clerk or a minor journalist.
No records confirm his movements, no diaries describe his thoughts. Only the letters remain, coded, sometimes incomplete, a trail of breadcrumbs that hint at the courage of a man who risked everything for an idea: freedom. One such letter, recovered from a forgotten archive in Connecticut, details British troop movements and supply shipments that directly led to the capture of Major John Andre and the exposure of Benedict Arnold's treason. The handwriting is precise, the cipher complex, and the signature, just a number, 723, points to Culper Jr., and yet no name accompanies it. Washington wrote in response, praising the intelligence, but Townsend's identity was never revealed. He became, in effect, a ghost, present when needed, absent when remembered. Even today, walking through the streets of Manhattan, one can imagine him slipping between shadows, delivering messages, listening for whispers, invisible to the soldiers who thought they controlled the city. He moved like a shadow across history, shaping events quietly, without recognition or reward. And that is why his story continues to fascinate. Historians, authors, and curious minds still search for the man behind the code, hoping to uncover the life of the nameless hero who saved a nation without ever stepping into its limelight. In every archive, every faded letter, every fragment of revolutionary history, his presence lingers. The ghost of Culper Jr. reminds us that some of history's greatest heroes never sought glory. They simply did what was necessary, vanished into the darkness, and left the world better than they found it.
Freedom's quiet architect. While muskets thundered and flags flew, one silent patriot built America's victory, one secret at a time. The roar of cannons echoed across the Hudson River, smoke curling into the morning sky. Soldiers shouted, drums thundered, and flags whipped in the wind. But in a quiet house on Long Island, one man moved unseen, his hands stained not with blood, but with ink. Abraham Woodhull, known in whispers as Culper Sr., was not on the battlefield. He did not charge with bayonet or fire musket, yet every movement he made, every letter he delivered, shaped the course of the revolution as much as any general's command. Woodhull walked through the streets of Setauket, nodding politely to British officers patrolling the roads. To them, he was just a modest farmer, concerned with crops and commerce. But beneath the surface, he carried secrets that would save Washington's army and frustrate the British at every turn. Each letter he smuggled was a thread in a larger web of intelligence. Invisible ink, coded messages, clandestine signals. These were the tools of his trade. He coordinated with Anna Strong, who signaled landing points with petticoats and handkerchiefs, and Caleb Brewster, who ferried messages across treacherous waters. Every success depended on trust, precision, and nerves of steel. One night, as snow fell softly over the village, Woodhull crouched in the shadows, listening to the faint splash of Brewster's boat approaching the shore. In his hands, a letter detailing British troop movements near West Point, a trap that could have destroyed Washington's army, waited for delivery. He took a deep breath and stepped forward. Every sense was alert. One misstep, one wrong glance from a passing soldier, and it would all be over. But the message was delivered. Crossing the river unseen, carrying intelligence that would turn the tide of the war. Woodhull returned home exhausted, yet he could not rest. Every day brought new dangers, new secrets to guard, and the constant threat that discovery would mean death. But he persisted,
quietly, steadfastly, because he knew the stakes. The revolution depended not only on muskets and cannonballs, but on shadows, whispers, and the courage of men like him. Years later, when the war ended and independence was secured, few remembered the man who had never set foot on a battlefield, yet shaped its outcomes in ways most could not see. Woodhull returned to his farm, tending fields, walking among neighbors who never guessed the magnitude of his sacrifice. History would eventually recognize the victories and the generals, the battles and the treaties, but the silent architect of freedom, the one who built America's victory one secret at a time, remained largely invisible. And yet, without him, without the courage to risk everything in quiet service, the revolution might have faltered. While muskets thundered and flags flew, it was men like Abraham Woodhull who ensured that liberty endured, forged not only with gunpowder alone, but with silence, stealth, and unyielding resolve.